Hi, John Herman here. This week I'd like to conclude our study of Lee Strobel's book, The Case for Christ. You recall that he was an atheist and an investigative reporter who set out to prove the impossibility of Christianity. His method of attack was to interview numerous experts in various fields of archaeology and religious studies and medical fields to refute what is written in the Bible regarding Jesus Christ. What we've learned so far was that the biographies of Jesus recounted in the Gospels can be trusted. They were based on eyewitness accounts that have been verified even by non-scriptural writers, some of whom were Jews who had no reason to make up these stories. They were merely disinterested parties reporting what they had either seen or learned directly from those who did witness certain events. Events including the crucifixion and the subsequent appearance of Jesus after his death. One other example I found fascinating, you may recall, was the mentioning in two such writings of a total darkening of the daytime sky. One writing also speaking of simultaneous earthquake in the geographical area where Jesus lived. These events were reported to have occurred in the year 33 AD. We also learned that archaeology can confirm the accuracy of these disinterested historical writers by examining the many modern archaeological findings. One expert made the comment that archaeology has never produced anything that is a contradiction to the Bible. The logic here is that if these unbiased historical writers were accurate in reporting verifiable facts, then they could be trusted in reporting facts regarding Jesus, facts that happen to agree with the gospel writers. Finally, we looked at what Strobel called fingerprint evidence. You recall the idea was that if enough Old Testament prophecies could be shown to apply to Jesus, then the result would be like a unique fingerprint match. Strobel interviewed an initially doubting Jew who had examined all of the 48 prophecies regarding the coming Messiah, and then compared them with the New Testament writings. He discovered that all of them applied to Jesus. The odds of that happening are so small that the mind cannot comprehend the number. Okay, let's move forward. This week, we're going to look into Strobel's examination of medical evidence. To get a professional opinion, Strobel visited Alexander Metherall, a prominent physician who had extensively studied the historical, archaeological, and medical evidence regarding the death of Jesus of Nazareth. He also had an engineering degree. He was the type of person who could report medical facts with no emotion and with a precision as a result of decades of laboratory research. To this day, there are those who subscribe to what is known as the swoon theory. The theory says that Jesus never really died on the cross. He only fainted and appeared dead. Later, he revived in the cool tomb and fled. There have been many books written and variations on the theory. Strobel's intent was to prove, medically speaking, that Jesus was actually dead. After all, no death equals no resurrection, and therefore no Christianity. Strobel began asking, what about the reports of Jesus sweating blood while praying in the garden? Metherell replied that this is an uncommon but documented condition known as hematidrosis. It is caused by extreme psychological distress. This stress causes chemicals to be released that break down the capillaries in the sweat glands. As a result, a small amount of blood is released with the sweat. In addition, those chemicals cause the skin to be extremely fragile, so that it is very sensitive to the touch. Not good for the flogging Jesus received the next day. Strobel continued by asking, what was the flogging like? The floggings were supposed to consist of 39 lashes, but many times the actual amount depended on the mood of the soldiers. The whip had metal balls and bone fragments woven into the leather thongs, which caused major damage with each blow. The flesh would become so shredded that the spine was exposed. The extent of the whipping extended from the shoulders down to the back of the legs. Some victims did not even survive to make it to their own crucifixion. At the least, the victim would experience tremendous pain and go into hypovolemic shock. That is a condition of low blood volume due to excessive bleeding. This would cause 1, elevated heart rate, 2, low blood pressure, 3, kidney shutdown, and 4, extreme thirst. Metherell pointed out that the scriptures confirm that Jesus was weak, remember he collapsed carrying the cross, and was thirsty, remember he made the remark, I thirst. Metherell was convinced that Jesus was in serious to critical condition before he even reached the crucifixion site. Next, the actual crucifixion was discussed. Strobel observed that crucifixion was not an exact form of execution. Plus, there were no medical examiners around to confirm death. Isn't there a possibility that as gruesome as the treatment was, Jesus could have survived? Could he have been given a drug to mimic death? Even Pilate was surprised that he had succumbed so quickly. Metherell made some medical comments regarding the crucifixion. First, when Jesus' arms were attached to the crossbeam, they were stretched to the point of dislocation. This was actually fulfilled in Psalm 22, my bones are out of joint. Then, the pain caused by a spike through the wrists would have been unimaginable, since it would have crushed and squeezed the median nerve. In fact, there was no word that described the amount of pain experienced, so one had to be invented. Excruciating. This means, literally, out of the cross. The same thing occurred when the nails were driven through the feet. Strobel then inquired about the actual cause of death. Metherell's response was that when the body is hanging in the vertical position, the muscles are stretched into the inhale position. This means that the victim has to push up with his feet to be able to exhale. Relaxing his feet would enable another inhalation. This cycle would continue until he became too exhausted to push up anymore, and he would asphyxiate. As the breathing slows, a condition occurs where the heart beats irregularly. This phenomena immediately precedes death, and is why Jesus knew the moment when death was to occur, and could say, Lord, into your hands I commend my spirit. He then died of cardiac arrest. Also, remember that during this period of irregular heartbeat and lack of blood volume, there would have been a collection of fluid called effusion around the heart and lungs. When the Roman soldier pierced Jesus' side, the spear probably pierced both the heart and the lungs, causing this clear fluid to flow out, followed by a large volume of blood. This, of course, recorded by the eyewitness John, who would probably have not understood what he was seeing medically, but recorded it nevertheless. It was the opinion of Metherell that at this point, Jesus was most certainly dead. If nothing else, a spear into the heart would have done him in. The next interview and area that Strobel investigated was the issue of the missing body. Skeptics say that a missing body does not mean that a person has been resurrected. They would say, rather, that the body was stolen, or the person was not really dead to start with, and they were able to escape the grave on their own. From the last interview, we saw that from the testimony given, it was impossible for Jesus to have survived the crucifixion. We are then left with the possibility that someone stole the body to make it appear that he had been resurrected. After all, with no resurrection, there's really nothing unique about Jesus. He simply had a great message about how to live. To find out, Strobel interviewed Dr. Lane Craig, a research professor of philosophy and a foremost expert on the resurrection. He asked Dr. Craig about the possibility that the body was stolen by the disciples in order to prove the resurrection actually happened. Curiously, Craig does not even resort to Matthew's account of the guards being present. He simply says that in reading the New Testament, we see that the disciples sincerely believed in the resurrection, a belief they proclaimed to their deaths. If they had stolen the body, why would they all be willing to die for a lie? Strobel then brought up the fact that skeptics point out that none of the gospel accounts agree with the details surrounding the discovery of the empty tomb. They argue that if there is no agreement on the details, why should the rest be believed? For example, the Gospels all differ on the names of the women that were present. Matthew mentions an earthquake that caused the stone to be rolled away, but the others don't. The number of angels present differs, and so on. Dr. Craig warns about throwing out the baby with the bathwater. There is a historical core to this story that can be depended upon, namely that the tomb was empty. That's the key point. The secondary facts are simply not important. In most cases, the discrepancies can be explained away, but Craig does not think doing so adds anything to the message. Regarding the proposal that the women's story was either legend or made up by the disciples, Craig points out that due to the status of women in that day, it would have been embarrassing to the disciples to have women discover the greatest event in human history. Most certainly, they would have had tried to cover up the legend, or if they were making up the story, to have one of them be the ones who had discovered the empty tomb. But in the big picture, what difference does it make to the message? Strobel is starting to become a believer and concedes that the tomb was, in fact, empty. And regarding the resurrection itself, Craig makes this concluding remark. As long as the existence of God is even possible, it's possible that he acted in history by raising Jesus from the dead. Finally, let's look at what evidence exists for Jesus' after-death experiences. To find out, Strobel interviewed Gary Habermas, another leading expert on the subject of the resurrection. His credentials are impressive. He basically confirmed what others have argued on the subject. All of his arguments come from the Bible itself. All four Gospels report post-death sightings of Jesus. In addition, the early creeds are mentioned as spoken by Paul. As we have previously stated, they were written only a few years after the crucifixion, which were therefore based on eyewitness accounts. Further, Paul had actually met with some of these eyewitnesses, namely Peter and James, and recorded what they told him. In one final interview, Strobel went on to speak with yet another expert on the subject of resurrection, this time focusing on whether there was circumstantial evidence regarding the event. The man's name was J.P. Moreland, a professor at the Talbot School of Theology. Strobel's question was this: can you give me examples of circumstantial evidence that will convince me that Jesus rose from the dead? Moreland responded with a few observations. 1. The lives of the disciples were changed. After the crucifixion, the disciples became discouraged and depressed. They no longer had confidence that Jesus had been sent by God. In fact, they believed that anyone crucified was cursed by God. They had been taught that God would not let his Messiah suffer death. But after a short time, we see them abandoning their occupations and committing themselves to spreading the message that Jesus was, in fact, the Messiah of God, who had died on the cross, returned to life, and was seen by them. In fact, they were willing to live a life of hardship and to ultimately die for their beliefs. Seeing the resurrected Lord is what changed their minds. Okay, another observation. Skeptics were converted. Jesus' own brother did not accept him as the Messiah, and Saul of Tarsus was actively persecuting the early Christians. What changed their mind and caused a 180-degree turnaround? It was their encounters with the living, resurrected Lord. Paul explicitly states this fact in Galatians. These skeptics were willing and even glad to go to their deaths because of their beliefs. Okay, observation number 3. Many Jews were converted. 5 weeks after Jesus' crucifixion, there were already 10,000 Jews who had converted to this new religion. These Jews were willing to give up all, including the renunciation of all 5 of the social institutions that they were taught from childhood. These included 1. Offering animal sacrifices to atone for their sins. 2. The importance of obeying the laws of Moses. 3. Scrupulously keeping the Sabbath. 4. Belief in only one God, that is, not acknowledging the Trinity. And 5. The idea that the Messiah would be a political leader who would defeat the Romans. Add to this the fact that during this time period, over 30,000 Jews were executed for their beliefs. In Moreland's way of thinking, how else would you explain why thousands of Jews in such a short period of time would abandon these 5 key practices if they had not either seen the resurrected Jesus or knew of someone that they trusted who did? The resurrection was a game changer. A simply charismatic personality would not have elicited such a response from so many people. The Jews were very content with their traditions. They gave them up because they had seen a miracle that they could not explain. The last observation Morehead pointed out was 4. The rapid emergence of the church. There is no question that the Christian church began shortly after the death of Jesus, and that it spread rapidly within a period of about 20 years. When a major cultural shift takes place, historians always look for events that can explain it. We have here a ragtag group of people whose primary message was that a crucified carpenter from an obscure village had triumphed over the grave. Yet, the message was wildly successful. A merely charismatic personality would not explain that cultural shift, especially after that personality had been dead for years. That is, unless there were witnesses to an out-of-this-world event, such as the resurrection. So, there we have it. Strobel acquired an enormous amount of information over his nearly 2 years of investigation. Things did not turn out all the way he expected them to. He discovered what true Christians accept by faith. He was the doubting Thomas that had to be shown the truth. But remember, Thomas was not rejected by Jesus because of his initial doubts. He was still loved. Now, the one thing that impressed me about this love was the sheer enormity of it. I realized that fact after I read about the gory details of what Jesus' suffering was actually like and what he went through for the likes of me. If Jesus knew what was coming, what would have motivated him to be degraded and brutalized the way that he was? The answer can be given in one word: love. That doesn't make logical sense, but it happened. Lee Strobel's life changed dramatically after his acceptance of Christ on a Sunday afternoon, shortly after his investigation concluded. Now, he's a good public speaker and freely shares that experience with those who care to listen. I strongly recommend listening to his story, which can be found on YouTube. He has a number of recorded videos. The one I listened to is about 40 minutes long and can be found on YouTube by searching Lee Strobel, Passion City Church. Have a good week.